Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into a fiery chapter of America's past, one that reshaped cities, displaced thousands, and still raises questions to this day. We're talking about the mysterious wave of urban fires that swept through 19th century America. Was it carelessness, catastrophe, or something more? Now, before we jump into the timeline of those infamous fires, let's set the stage. Imagine yourself walking through an American city in the mid-1800s. It smells like coal, horses, and sawdust. The buildings creak with age and wind. Everything around you, and I mean everything, is made of wood. The streets, the sidewalks, even the rooftops. Between 1800 and 1900, America's urban population exploded. In 1800, fewer than 1 in 10 Americans lived in cities. But by the turn of the century, it was nearly 4 in 10. That's a massive transformation in just one lifetime, driven by the Industrial Revolution, waves of immigration, and the expansion of the railroad. Cities weren't growing gradually, they were exploding outward and upward. And what did they build with? Wood. Lots of it. It was cheap, abundant, and easy to work with. But it was also incredibly flammable. Sidewalks, stairs, homes, storefronts, all of it was kindling, just waiting for a spark. You might as well have been living inside a matchbox. And then came the technology. Gas lighting was the bright new thing, literally. It lit the streets, it lit homes, it gave cities a sense of modern flair. But here's the problem: leaky gas pipes, open flames, and wooden buildings don't mix well. Add to that the new telegraph wires, which could arc or snap, and you've got a recipe for disaster. The city of the future had just become a fire trap. And who was prepared to stop these fires? Almost no one. Most cities didn't have professional fire departments yet. Instead, they relied on volunteer brigades, men with buckets. Basically, there were no unified codes, no smoke alarms, and no organized evacuation plans. The warning systems were primitive at best: bells, shouting, or whatever sound you could make fast enough to alert the neighbors. So let's summarize the scene: a population boom, wooden cities, flammable tech, and no real plan to put out a fire once it started. Sound dangerous? It was. And as we'll see in the next section, the fires came, one after another, in some of the biggest cities in the country. The question is, why so many? Why then? And who, if anyone, might have benefited from the flames? Let's move forward and take a closer look at the timeline of destruction. Let's take a look at what I like to call the timeline of flames, because starting in the mid-1800s, something strange began happening. One by one, major American cities burst into flames. Not just small house fires. We're talking about entire districts wiped off the map. And it didn't just happen once. It happened again, and again, and again. First, we've got the infamous Chicago fire of 1871. This wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a full-blown urban apocalypse. The flames consumed over 17,000 buildings. 100,000 people, that's almost 1/3 of the city, were left homeless overnight. Damage costs? Around $200 million. That's in 1871 money. Adjusted for today, we're talking several billion. And here's the kicker: the fire spread so fast that entire neighborhoods vanished before firefighters could even respond. Just 1 year later, yes, 1 year, Boston lit up in flames. The Boston Fire of 1872 tore through 65 acres of downtown. It destroyed 776 buildings, crushed dozens of businesses, and racked up $75 million in damages. That fire moved so quickly it jumped entire streets, overwhelming the city's volunteer fire brigades within hours. But it wasn't just Chicago and Boston. San Francisco burned repeatedly throughout the second half of the 1800s. From the Gold Rush era to the Great Quake Fire combo in 1906, the city suffered more than half a dozen catastrophic blazes. By the time the 1906 quake hit, over 80% of San Francisco was destroyed, and much of that devastation wasn't from the earthquake. It was from the fire that followed. Now if you're thinking, well, maybe that's just a few unlucky cities, think again. Let's widen the lens. Portland in 1866, Detroit in 1805, St. Louis in 1849, Milwaukee in 1853. All of them suffered massive fires. All of them happened within the same century, many of them within the same few decades. And in nearly every case, the cause was either uncertain or blamed on the weather, a cow, a lantern, or some other small spark that somehow managed to consume entire blocks. So, what's going on here? Was this just an age of bad luck and open flames? Or is there something deeper at work, something about how these cities were built, how they were run, or even how they were rebuilt after the fact? Because when disasters happen over and over, and follow the same pattern, maybe it's not random anymore. Maybe it's systemic. Maybe it's profitable. Let's dig deeper. So let's ask the uncomfortable question: were these fires just accidents, or were they symptoms of something much bigger? Because once you look past the smoke and ash, a disturbing picture starts to emerge, one where infrastructure, incentives, and intent all seem to intertwine. Let's start with the obvious, flammable construction. Most urban buildings at the time were made almost entirely of wood, not just houses, but warehouses, businesses, factories, sidewalks, and even roofs. And it wasn't just the wood, it was the tar, the pitch, the oil-soaked fabrics, and the kindling stuffed between walls for insulation. Basically, you had entire city blocks constructed like campfires waiting for a match. And in many neighborhoods, those buildings were packed tightly together with barely any space in between. Once a fire started, it didn't walk, it sprinted. Then there's the issue of urban density and poor building codes. These cities weren't planned, they were improvised. As immigrants poured in and industries expanded, housing was thrown up as fast and cheap as possible. Safety wasn't the priority, speed was. Narrow alleyways, no zoning laws, and structures built practically on top of each other meant that once a blaze broke out, containment was nearly impossible. Imagine trying to stop a fire in a maze made of gasoline-soaked matchsticks. But here's where things start to feel suspicious. Economic incentives. You see, a fire doesn't just destroy, it clears. It clears land. It clears legal barriers. It clears out people who may not be wanted in that part of town. And in some cases, that clearing opened the door to lucrative redevelopment projects. Old, run-down buildings wiped out overnight, insurance payouts, new construction permits, and prime real estate suddenly up for grabs. It's no wonder that some cities, and some property owners, were accused of looking the other way. After all, a fire could be bad for residents, but great for investors. And finally, there's the post-war chaos. The Civil War left much of the country in economic and political disarray. Infrastructure was crumbling, cities were under strain, and local governments were weak, both financially and structurally. Corruption was rampant. Reconstruction meant contracts, kickbacks, and political favoritism. Fires, whether accidental or not, often accelerated these deals. And in the confusion, accountability was almost non-existent. So let's take a step back. We've got cities built like tinderboxes, no regulation, massive profit potential after destruction, and governments too weak or too complicit to prevent any of it. Does that sound like a coincidence? Or does it sound like the perfect storm? Either way, the response to these fires was not just to rebuild, it was to reorganize power. Let's see how. After the smoke cleared, something interesting happened. It wasn't just buildings that got rebuilt. It was the entire structure of urban control. In the aftermath of these massive fires, many American cities didn't simply replace what they lost. They reinvented themselves, not from the ground up, but from the top down. Let's start with the new blueprint, urban planning from above. City officials, architects, and private consultants took this moment to redraw entire maps. Streets were widened. New grid systems were imposed. Building materials and layouts were suddenly dictated not by communities, but by centralized plans. The argument was simple: safety, efficiency, progress. But the result? Cities that were no longer shaped by those who lived in them, but by those who governed them. Next came the rise of professional fire services. Now, on the surface, this was a positive step. Volunteer brigades were replaced with trained, paid departments. And yes, that made a huge difference in response times and effectiveness. But it also meant something else: standardization, regulation, control. Firefighting was no longer a local, grassroots effort. It became part of a growing municipal bureaucracy, a system where decisions and oversight came from centralized authorities, not the neighborhood down the street. And who paid for all this change? That's where it gets even more layered. Federal and corporate funding poured into reconstruction efforts. Banks, railroads, and insurance companies had a vested interest in reshaping the cities they operated in. The federal government, flush with post-war power, partnered with private capital to fund projects that served both political and economic goals. Roads, utilities, and industrial corridors didn't just reappear, they were strategically placed. And often, those placements favored the powerful. But there were social consequences. Zoning laws and redevelopment plans disproportionately affected the working class and immigrant communities. Entire neighborhoods were uprooted or erased in the name of progress. And while cities grew more organized on paper, real people lost their homes, their businesses, and their ability to shape their own environments. You see, fire wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a catalyst, and in its aftermath, those with power found new ways to expand it, often behind the noble banner of safety and efficiency. But not everyone went along quietly. Some resisted, some rebuilt, and some chose a different path altogether. Let's talk about them next. Now let's zoom in, away from the city halls, the banks, and the federal blueprints. Let's look at the people, because while officials planned from above, ordinary citizens were already fighting fires, literally and figuratively, from below. And their responses weren't just reactive, they were proactive, resourceful, and deeply rooted in mutual aid and voluntary action. First, the volunteer fire brigades. Long before cities had organized departments, communities took it upon themselves to defend their homes. Bucket brigades, fire watches, night patrols. These weren't professionals. They were neighbors, farmers, shopkeepers, teenagers. They grabbed what they had, formed a line, and fought the flames together. Was it perfect? No, but it was fast, local, and driven by responsibility, not salary. Then came the rebuilding, and here's where it gets really inspiring. In many cases, especially in immigrant and religious neighborhoods, it wasn't the city that rebuilt after a fire. It was the people. Communities pooled their resources. They shared labor. Churches, synagogues, and fraternal organizations became rebuilding hubs. Instead of waiting for permission or funding, they acted. Brick by brick, beam by beam. These weren't just repairs. They were declarations of autonomy. And how did they manage risk? Enter the insurance cooperatives. Mutual aid societies, often overlooked in official histories, created neighborhood insurance pools. No big company, no government mandate, just local people agreeing to share the burden if disaster struck. If your home burned down, your neighbors helped cover the cost. These cooperatives weren't just financial tools, they were trust networks, voluntary systems that worked outside the state, based on shared responsibility and common interest. And not everyone accepted new zoning laws or top-down redevelopment, either. In fact, some cities saw serious pushback. Property owners resisted forced sales. Neighborhood groups fought new regulations that would strip them of control. In some places, legal battles erupted over the right to rebuild without government interference. That resistance didn't always win, but it showed that people weren't just passive recipients of change. They had a vision of their own. So while officials and investors redrew cities from boardrooms, everyday citizens were shaping their own recovery through cooperation, tradition, and the power of voluntary association. And that raises an important question. Which model was more sustainable? And maybe more importantly, which model respected the people who lived there? In our final section, we'll explore how both paths, centralized and decentralized, created ripple effects that still shape policy, property, and power to this day. Let's take a look. Once the flames were out and the smoke had settled, a new battle began. Not a battle over rubble, but over control. Because the fires didn't just reshape city skylines, they reshaped policy, insurance, real estate, and power itself. What started as a crisis response soon became a mechanism for managing, or manipulating, the future of urban America. Let's begin with zoning and eminent domain. After the fires, governments began using recovery efforts as a pretext to impose new zoning regulations. The stated goal was order, safety, and modernization. But in practice, these zoning powers often meant forced relocations, redistricting, and land seizures. If your property was in the way of a new plan, a wider road, a new business district, it could be taken, sometimes through purchase, sometimes through regulation, and sometimes through sheer pressure. Then came the insurance restructuring. The massive payouts from urban fires rocked the insurance industry. In response, companies imposed tighter rules, more exclusions, and stricter enforcement. Risk assessments became more centralized. State regulators stepped in, and what used to be a mutual promise between neighbors became a complex web of contracts, codes, and compliance. That leads us into the rise of corporate urbanism. As cities rebuilt, real estate development became big business. Finance capital flooded into reconstruction. Investors prioritized commercial districts, luxury buildings, high-value zones. In short, places that could turn a profit. Neighborhoods that didn't fit the new vision, often sidelined. Redevelopment followed money, not people. And this created tension, because as state and corporate actors shaped the new urban order, many communities began to feel displaced, ignored, or outright erased. Debates erupted between central planners and local residents, between eminent domain and private property rights, between state oversight and community control. In some cities, these tensions sparked lawsuits. In others, protests. And in nearly every case, the legacy of fire left behind more than just ashes. It left unresolved questions about who cities are for and who gets to decide their future. What began as a physical emergency had evolved into a political one, and perhaps an ideological one too. So let's bring all of this together, because in the final section, we're going to step back, way back, and ask the biggest question of all. Were these fires just tragic accidents, or something else entirely? So now we return to the question we started with. Were these fires just accidents, or were they resets? Because when you line up all the patterns, all the timing, and all the consequences, it becomes harder to believe that these were just isolated tragedies. In fact, they may have been opportunities, at least for some. Look at what happened after the fires. Slums were cleared, immigrant neighborhoods disappeared, land values shifted, old contracts were erased, and in their place, a new city, a new economy, a new order, often designed by those already in power. That raises a tough question: were fires ever welcomed? Maybe not openly, maybe not officially, but could there have been incentives, economic, political, or even bureaucratic, that made destruction preferable to reform? When incentives are misaligned, strange things happen. Insurance companies, real estate developers, city planners, they didn't necessarily start the fires, but they may have benefited from them. And if benefiting from disaster becomes predictable, then so does the disaster itself. And when we compare the two responses, centralized versus voluntary, the divide becomes even sharper. One path imposed new systems from the top down. It brought organization, yes, but also control, surveillance, and exclusion. The other path, mutual aid, community rebuilding, local resistance, was messy, slow, and deeply human. It protected autonomy, but not always efficiently. So we ask, which model truly served the people? And maybe most importantly, who profits and who pays? Because in almost every case, the ones who lost their homes, their businesses, and their neighborhoods were not the ones writing the new city plans. The destruction displacement profit cycle didn't fall evenly. It disproportionately affected the poor, the working class, and the already marginalized. So as we look back on the great fires of American history, we don't just see smoke and rubble. We see a story about power, about rebuilding, and about how crisis becomes opportunity, depending on where you sit. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like the video, drop a comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces that shaped our world. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. It's linked in the description below. Until next time, stay curious, question everything, and keep seeking the truth behind history.